Welcome back to our channel. We are revisiting our series about getting dressed in different historical periods. And today we are actually going to go way up in the social class to a place we haven't been yet. We are going to talk about the clothing of a 17th century gentleman, since there were gentlemen who came here in the first ship of men and boys who came in 1607. And so we'll be able to contrast the clothing of a very elite upper-class gentleman with those of the average English colonist, which we have already explored in a previous video, so make sure to check that one out also. To illustrate the clothing of an English gentleman, I'm going to have my friend Jay join us today.
Good morning.
And Jay is looking very fine and very fashionable in his clothing here. You could probably hear him coming before you even saw him, that rustling of all the silk that he's wearing. Now, when we compare these clothes to the clothes that we explored of an average English colonist of the early 17th century, you'll notice that the actual garments themselves that he's wearing are the same. On his upper body, he has a doublet, this close-fitting sort of, we might think of it as a jacket today, close-fitting here, and breeches on his legs, as well as stockings to cover his lower legs, shoes. Those are all the same types of garments that you would see regardless of where you are in the social class. What makes them different are the fabrics that they're made of. So Jay's suit here is made out of black silk satin, and the first thing you might notice are all of these slashes that are cut into the silk satin here. But what is behind these slashes isn't his shirt. You're not seeing directly through the garment. It's actually an additional layer of silk, in this case silk taffeta, that is behind here that you can see. And a lot of folks will ask us, well, what was the purpose of all of these slashes? Does it add any kind of ventilation or cooling? Well, as I mentioned, the slashes are just on this outer layer of the garment, and the silk taffeta behind it, there's also a linen lining and linen interlining as well, so there's a lot of layers in this garment. It's really not providing any additional cooling. It's as Jay will attest, it's entirely for fashion. And you can see the slashes here are going on the bias of the fabric, which means that even though there are raw edges here, it's not going to fray, as well as the fact that the fabrics that were made in the early 17th century were just of a better quality than a lot of what we can get today, so they weren't too concerned about it completely fraying apart here. The doublet also has all of this trim on it, and this is made out of a mix of silk and metal threads that are woven together. And the people who make trim like this, they were an entirely separate trade of largely women, known as silk women, who would weave different trims and cords and things like this out of silk. He also has buttons that were made specifically for the doublet to match it. They are also made out of silk. And the inside of the button is a wooden bead, essentially, that is wound about with silk in different colors to match the doublet. His breeches are made out of the same silk satin as the doublet, and if I could have Jay lift up these skirts here of the doublet, you'll see that the doublet is connected to the breeches here by means of what are known as points. And the points are these ties here that have a metal aglet on the end of them. And that the aglet helps the points go through the eyelets, where the holes that are worked in both the waistband and the band here in the doublet, and it prevents that end from fraying. You still have aglets on your shoelaces. It's that little plastic point. We still call them aglets. And these type of aglets are found by the dozen, really, over at the archaeological site at Jamestown, because folks like John Smith, he was recommending men bring a dozen points with them. They're just very useful for tying all sorts of things together. And in a period before suspenders, and in a period where belts, or as they were called, girdles, were really used to hang things from, not hold your breeches up. This is really the primary method of keeping things where they should be and in place. Thank you. The breeches are full and gathered here at the waist, and they're also full and gathered at the knee. Very popular style in the first quarter of the 17th century, and again, requiring quite a bit of fabric. Jay has nice stockings on his legs and shoes as well. And when we take a look at here, his neck, he's wearing a fine falling band made out of fine linen that is starched. You can see there's a little bit of stiffness here to it. And this is a style that came about in the early 17th century that sort of was a new addition to neckwear of the period. In the 16th century, it became very fashionable to wear ruffs like these. And this is made out of a long strip of linen that is gathered into a band and then starched and ironed to create the shapes that you see here, these sort of figure 8 sets, as they're called. And this continued to be fashionable in the early 17th century as well, but you also have the option of wearing a falling band collar like this. So you could either choose to have your nice ruff or falling band collar, and he could also have matching cuffs here as well at the wrist that would look similar to what you see here in the band, or could also have little wrist ruffs as well here. Now, these might seem impractical when you look at them, but they actually serve an important purpose, and that is keeping the doublet itself clean at the wrist and neck, where often the body is rubbing against these places of the garment. So by having these linen pieces that are separate, or you can see here the cuff of Jay's shirt is also protecting the doublet from his skin. That's the purpose of these linen garments, whether it's a smock or shirt, which is the basic undergarment that we're both wearing, or these linen accessories, because the linen can be washed. We're not going to wash this beautiful silk satin suit, but we can wash the linen undergarments, and that is protection for the clothing, and it's also the way that people of this period are keeping themselves clean by putting on clean undergarments, shirts, or smocks for women, changing out these linen accessories, or for women we'll wear a coif, which is the English pronunciation. We're not going to be French and call it a coif. We're English, so it's a coif. It's all keeping our body clean. Now, we're inside right now, but if Jay were to step out, he might want to put on a fine felt hat. This style is sort of a unisex style. Men and women are wearing this. It's very fashionable. And depending on your social scale, a gentleman such as Jay here would have a felt hat made of fur felt. And that could be from beaver, from rabbit, and that is a more expensive, finer, more fashionable material than, say, a wool felt, which the average colonist might have. But this tall style is very fashionable. You also see shorter crowns as well, but this is going to stay in fashion for pretty much the entire century here. So you may recall from previous videos about our average male colonist or the Farrar Papers, we have a lot of information in written sources about the type of clothing that colonists brought with them or were suggested to bring with them. John Smith wrote a list of things that he suggested, and they were a variety of suits that he thought would be practical, you know, a cloth suit for winter, a frieze suit especially for winter, a canvas suit for summer, very practical garments. And we see those types of fabrics, canvas, cloth, frieze, being purchased over and over again in Virginia Company records for the various people who are coming here. However, when we look at gentlemen, we actually have written documentation for the types of clothing that a gentleman, such as Jay, would like to have here in Virginia. And it provides a good contrast to the examples of all of this canvas and cloth that the average colonist might have. And that comes from George Percy. And he came from a very wealthy family, and he was in a position of leadership at Jamestown, at various times serving as president of the council and then deputy governor. But he wanted to be able to perpetuate the lifestyle as much as possible that he was used to in England. A lot of people might look at something like Jay is wearing with all these accessories and think, why would you even bother out here in Virginia? But it's important to remember that for the English, they were very much concerned with maintaining their sense of identity as English people and everything that entailed. That meant building houses here in England that were English make, having clothing that was English, and also that reinforced the social order that they were accustomed to. Because if you could maintain social order, especially here in a place like Virginia, hopefully we could maintain morality and good behavior, and that's what they hoped they could do through clothing, which is why we have things like essentially sumptuary laws that dictated what people could wear and what they couldn't wear. Even though those had gone out of fashion in England, James got away with them when he came to the throne, individual groups could still have them, and the Virginia Company did have their own sumptuary laws. So only somebody like a head of a hundred or plantation could have silk clothing, only members of the council could have silk clothing, and the average person could not. So we can tell from this fine silk clothing that Jay is a man of leadership and wealth here in the colony. George Percy wants to maintain his social status, his standing, so that people can see that he is up there on the social ladder. And so the fabrics that he's asking for his new clothing reflect that. A lot of the clothes that we see in this particular record are very fine wool fabrics that also are mixed with silk, things that would have been known as stuffs in the 17th century. And those have some pretty interesting names like Perpetuano and Camlet. And in the case of Camlet, that is a fabric that could be mixed with silk. So you have wool and silk that are woven together for that fabric. He also has a suit of Mikado, which is a type of velvet. And Mikado wouldn't have been all silk, which would have been the finest velvet that you could have. It could have had a base of wool or linen, and then the pile, that the fluffy part of the velvet, could have been silk. So there's some practicality to it, but definitely much, much finer than the average frieze or cloth, as they were calling a lot of woolen fabrics at the time that you see. George Percy also has 12 pairs of shoes that he has sent over, and you can definitely understand, I think, especially if you've worked here, having 12 shoes would be quite nice. And that's compared to, the average maybe 2 or 3 that we see other folks coming over with or purchasing for themselves. And Percy also had 6 pairs of boots. And boots are definitely something that seems to be more associated with gentlemen, anybody who might ride, soldiers. But in addition to his boots, he had boot hose, which were a special kind of sort of stocking that would come up and over the top of the boot, so you could see a little bit of that fine linen and sometimes lace. George Percy also has bands and cuffs that are listed, so we've addressed Jay in his falling band here. So you can see by comparing some of these things that George Percy has to the average soldier or colonist that he was of fine standing. Even his shirts were made of cambric and holland, which were very, very fine types of linen, certainly some of the finest linen that you could purchase at the time, while the average colonist might have a canvas smock or shirt or something not quite as nice as cambric, which truly would have been very comfortable to wear. But it was important for the English to perpetuate those different levels of society, because they really thought that somebody who dressed like this, if they were just an average colonist, that was as bad to them as somebody who spent their time gambling or drinking. They really thought it was a social ill to have people dressing above their station, because for them it reinforced their society, it reinforced order. And trying to maintain order would have been a source of safety and security when they're out here in Virginia. So clothing, we might think of it as, a way to just cover ourselves, provide protection, but in the 17th century, it had a lot of deeper meanings for people here in Virginia. Well, thank you so much for joining us again for another Getting Dressed video here in the 17th century. If you liked our video, give it a thumbs up and leave us a comment down below. If you have any questions about what Jay is wearing or anything that I've said, we would be happy to be in conversation with you. And also don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss the next video. And we look forward to seeing you again.